Thank you. Are we good? Hi, thank you. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Lisa, to the committee, to everybody who came. I'm a writer, I'm an editor, and I'm having trouble finding the words to express my awe and appreciation and gratitude for this community. I feel like I was already in love with the Met Box before I came, and now I want to marry it. It's just the greatest. But I didn't mean to do that. So when Lisa called, she asked me to speak specifically as an elementary person. And this blew my mind, because this doesn't happen anywhere else. This only would happen in our community that you would think, feels like it's going in and out. Do you hear me? Okay. That there would be the idea to have an elementary person come speak to a mostly secondary group. So, yeah, it's coming in and out, right? Okay. I'm going to ignore that. So, I just want to tell you that this is my first Twitter math camp. And I didn't come earlier for reasons. I had reasons besides not wanting to go to Oklahoma in July. I had other reasons too, which were, I was worried about invading your space. So from an elementary point of view, it's pretty rare that a day goes by when I don't talk to Kristen Gray and Graham Fletcher and Joe Schwartz and Brian and Zach and Mike and Elham and Kazia. These are my people, my tribe, and we hardly get any time together. So I really value the time that we get together in person. And when I found out that you had created a conference by yourselves, for yourselves, where teachers were the ones giving the professional development in the way that you felt you needed, and I found out that attendance was capped, I was really worried about coming, because I felt like if I came, I was taking the seat of somebody else who was secondary, and you guys need more time to collaborate. Over time, my thinking has really evolved on that. I have a different view about what I might have to offer you and what I might learn from you. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is what has the last few years for me been like online to do math publicly as an elementary school teacher with a bunch of secondary teachers, and what I have noticed we might be able to learn from each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a framework, and then I'm going to tell you some stories. And that's going to, I hope, spark some thinking in you about where we might go from here. In the stories, I'm going to talk about the moments that changed my thinking from I shouldn't go to Twitter Math Camp to I should. Okay? So one of those seminal moments was in response to this blog. Like many of you, I am a huge fan of Ben Orlin. It's one of those blogs that never makes it to my reader because I have to go read it immediately when Math with Bad Drawings comes out. I almost always laugh, and I think I always learn something. But last December, he posted this blog, and it was called Which Level of Teaching is Right for You? And it was centered around this graph, and I had a heart attack. And so I had a fantastic conversation with Ben through the comments in his blog, and I'm sharing this with permission from him today. He wants to know what you think about this graph. He has kept the blog up so that we can keep talking about it, because it turned out to be a good discussion point. So before I tell you my issues with it, I would really like to know what you think about it. So I made my first ever activity builder. I learned how to do that at DesCon in San Francisco. So head there and let's see what you think. And feel free to talk or not talk as you like. And let's see how big the laugh is. Yeah. K7, right? Oh, sorry, 5 through KZ.
I'm quite proud of that. Check out my super horizontal line. Yeah. Biggest accomplishment of the day. Mine was squiggly, so that's my second one. I'm so excited. The top screen is like
Go Desmond sketch, eh? Okay, we're heading off task. So I'm going to change the screen to take attention away from that behavior. And it just take a second if you haven't done a figure screen.
Teachers are the worst students, right?
Where you were like, this doesn't make sense or this doesn't work. My formative assessment, though, I'm going to be sitting with this data set later. I'm very curious about it. Based on what I just saw, I have my work cut out for me with some of you. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my issues with this graph, which I shared with Ben. The first thing is I felt like he's dismissing really important things. So I'm going to start with where that content knowledge arrow starts. I feel, and the reason I got upset was I feel like it's not helpful to say you don't need content knowledge to teach little kids. And I hear it from student teachers all the time. They say, I love teaching, I love reading, I love kids, I'm not really a math person, so I'm going to teach K2. And a little piece of me dies inside when I hear that. Because K2 deals with cardinality, ordinality, what the operations mean, how we can represent those symbolically. It deals with ideas like you can talk about shapes based on their attributes and their properties, and you can look for patterns in those, and that's something you can discuss with other people. K2 introduces equality and inequality, sameness and difference. K2 deals with zero. I mean, I am talking about massive concepts. K2 K2 is also students' introduction to what it means to do mathematics. What is math as a discipline? What does it mean to know the truth in this particular discipline? What does it mean to be convinced of something? How can we change our minds in math? That's different for every discipline. And K2 teachers are the ones who get to teach kids what it means to have a mathematical discussion, a mathematical idea, a mathematical question. Also, what it feels like to do math, and what it means to be good at math. So K2 is the introduction to all of this world, and please don't call that the basics. That's not helpful to anybody, Sadie's like. That's not helpful to us, and frankly, that's not helpful to you either. I don't see any good that comes out of that. Should I just hold the mic? Is that better? All right, okay. Suddenly I'm like, boom. So, my favorite reference on this is Li-Ping Ma. She wrote a book in 1999 that's super powerful. And she argues that elementary mathematics is a field unto itself that is worthy of study and respect and value because we're dealing with incredibly important concepts in elementary math. She does a cross-cultural comparison between China and the United States. And what she finds is that in the United States, we tend to define how good we are at math based on how far we go. Did you take trig? Did you take pre-calc? Did you take calc? Did you take any math in college? Somehow that's our identity. In China, most elementary school teachers do not go past 8th grade math in their own educations. But when asked to write a story problem that represents division of fractions, 90% of Chinese teachers can, and 4% of American teachers can. So Ma showed that there's a difference between how far you go and how deep you go. And I would argue that whatever grade level we teach, we need to go deep into our content. So that's where I take issue with the content line. Similarly, secondary teachers, I don't feel like that graph is fair to you. Pedagogy matters in second grade. If you took mugshots of my teachers from 8th grade on and you showed me their faces, I'd recognize like one of them. But if you handed them a piece of chalk and had them stand like this, I'd be like, yeah, that's Miss Dinkus. I can pick her out of the crowd, right? My secondary teachers were content specialists. They knew their math. They did not have good pedagogy, and I did not learn very much from them. So it is not doing you any favors to say, hey, if you care more about math than pedagogy, teach secondary. This is where the whole premise of the graph started to fall apart for me, though, because I felt like it was pitting content against pedagogy, and I don't really get that. That's not how I think about it. It's also pitting elementary against secondary, and I don't find that very productive for our community. So in searching around for the way I would describe it, an image that makes sense to me, I left the graph and I tried to find a visual that I think works. And the visual that I go to is a suspension bridge. And this might resonate for some people. This is the Bear Mountain Bridge. I grew up under 2 miles from this bridge, so it's an impressed image for me. It's the prototype for the George Washington Bridge that's down the river. It's a really pretty bridge. And like all good suspension bridges, really, like all suspension bridges, the Bear Mountain Bridge has this basic structure. There are 2 essential parts. There are the parts in green. They're called the towers of the bridge. All suspension bridges have this. They have 2. And they are dug down deep into the bedrock of the earth, and they rise up tall and powerful, and they are strong enough so that you can build on top of them. You can suspend a whole bridge from them. And that span is what we actually use to get from one side of the river to the other. So for me, content and pedagogy are those towers. It doesn't make sense to have one and not the other. The red part of the bridge is what is usually called pedagogical content knowledge. I'm going to wait, I see some heads. I'm going to post the slides, okay? So this term comes from Lee Shulman. In the mid-'80s, he gave some talks that were really important, and it continues to be cited. He called it the missing paradigm. He showed that through history, sometimes we emphasize content and sometimes we emphasize pedagogy, and it didn't make any sense to him, kind of like Ben's graph didn't make sense when I was looking at it. He said what really matters is pedagogical content knowledge. And he defined PCK, it's abbreviated, as our specialized knowledge. PCK is what differentiates someone who can read and speak and write in English from someone who can teach English. It separates someone who can do math from someone who can teach math. And it separates someone who can teach math from someone who can teach French. It is intimately tied to our content, and it's built on our pedagogy. And this is where the interesting stuff happens. So to give you an example, let's say our content is that addition commutes. We want to teach kids that addition commutes. We want to teach kids that we can represent that idea in this general way. We want to teach kids that mathematicians are interested in the general case. That's the content we want to teach. My pedagogy, my general pedagogy, is not content specific. It's what makes it so I can get kids' attention. It's what makes it so that I can facilitate a discussion. It's what makes it so I know how to plan an opening of a lesson, a close of a lesson, do a turn and talk. That's general pedagogy. If I have those, I can go here where the rich stuff is. And the rich stuff is, how do I create conditions so that these specific students, whom I know and have built a relationship with, will learn this content that I want to teach. So I'm going to think about the curriculum I know, I'm going to think about the resources I have, I'm going to think about what happened when I assess them informally, and I'm going to think about all the different ideas I have to make this happen. That's pedagogical content knowledge, and that's where we all want to be. So without both, we're here, right? With both, we get to work on all the things. And what I said to Ben is, really, we all need to work on all the things, right? Like it just comes down to that for me. But there is an element of truth in Ben's graph, and I am not going to ignore that, which is that, and I'm making gross generalizations here, and there are caveats and exceptions, but as a field, elementary math tends to have really strong pedagogy, because we've been studying pedagogy for many years. We've never been able to lecture to 7-year-olds, so we've always had all these different strategies that we use. Things that secondary math is suddenly like, hey, that's really interesting to me, right? So we tend to have really strong pedagogy and not very strong content, and we need to work on our content knowledge. And every elementary teacher I know who thinks about this kind of stuff will agree with that, right? My peeps here, they're not. Secondary teachers tend to have more enthusiasm for and knowledge of their content and not that grounding in pedagogy, right? So we each have areas of strength and we each have things to work on, and that makes me think about, could we work together in some way? And that makes me think about this community. I love this picture so much. This picture came out of Nashville, and you have every grade level represented right there. And aside from the fact that they're like twins, it's so cute, right? So this community is unique in that we have a forum in which people from all the different grade levels talk. That doesn't happen in districts where I work, and that does not happen at conferences unless you're part of this community. So what I want to do now that you have that kind of bridge in your mind, is I want to shift into stories that get at how we might learn from each other. And these are going to be from my experience as who I am, a white female teacher who teaches elementary and has entered the secondary space and played math with y'all. So story number one. I'm so sad she's not here. Kate, I'm crushed you are not here. I'm saying that to the cameras. So I want to tell you about the moment I joined Twitter. And I'm not talking about when I got my account, I'm talking about the moment I emotionally joined and became invested in this community. And I had gotten on Twitter, I lurked briefly, but then I was really interested, so I joined the conversation pretty fast. And I was so curious about this community. Justin, this is one of my favorite tweets of all time. I noticed with tweets like this, that this community was not just about impressing each other, which I think was my expectation. And I feel like Justin is one of our leaders in showing that when we make our learning public, all kinds of wonderful things happen. And admitting what we don't know is the first step to that. And I first looked at that tweet and I went, holy shit, he's on the internet. Like students can see that, teachers parents can see that. I mean, it was an adjustment, and I think I love all our outreach efforts that like Julie and Sam and all these amazing people are doing all the time. And Tina, where's Tina? But I wonder, when I talk to new people for Twitter, this is often their concern, is like, how might I get bitten by being public about not knowing? Are you kidding me, right? So I was really inspired by this tweet and some others, and I decided I'm gonna do that. And I was reading a book, and it had a piece of math in it that it said was a mental math problem, and I couldn't for the life of me see how you could do it mentally. And that's because the sum of squares is something, if I ever learned it, I had forgotten. But I didn't know that at the time. So I just took a picture of it, and I tweeted it out, and I said, I don't understand this, can somebody help? Inspired by Justin. And this whole great conversation started, and it was fantastic, and in the middle of it, Kate Nowak laid this tweet on me. And I know my tribe. Don't do the math yet. I'm going to give you a chance in just a second, okay? So I just want you to imagine you're me. You're an elementary school teacher. You're at home. You know enough to know who Kate Nowak is and her role in this community. And you see this tweet. And I'm not proud of this at all, but I'm going to be totally honest with you. That my initial reaction was just what you saw. Holy shit, I think she just assigned me a problem. I haven't done algebra like this in 20 years. And I thought about it for a second, and I swear this is true. I kind of went, fuck her. Who was also not here. So I looked at this and I thought, she is just somebody on the internet. I've never met her. This is not a real person to me. I don't owe her anything, right? Where does all this defensiveness come from? It's not from Kate. She didn't spark it. She didn't do a thing wrong here. She actually graciously invited me to play math with her. I felt fear. Right? I felt fear of making a fool of myself on the internet with a bunch of high school teachers. So I thought, look at the timestamp, it was 5:43. My husband was downstairs making dinner. They said dinner was ready. I was like, okay, and I swear this is true. This shows you how much I've grown. I said, I'm gonna pretend I didn't see this. I'm gonna go have dinner. And I bet by the time I get back, somebody else will have answered it. Just what our kids do, right? I mean, I was like, I'm gonna count on someone else in the class. So I go downstairs, I have dinner. There have been other people in the conversation. I come back upstairs to see who chimed in and how they solved the problem, and it looks just like this still. And I have to say, I was so moved by that, because that was not just polite, that was like respectful of us, that she asked me this question and people were going to give me space to answer without going, I know it, right? And that was the moment when she stopped being just somebody on the internet. And all the other people in the conversation stopped being somebody on the internet. They became my colleagues, and they were treating me so well. And so I sat down with a piece of paper, and I thought, I'm going to try this problem. I'm not sure I'm going to tweet it out, but I'm going to try this problem. So, do I have time? Can I give you 2 minutes? Just get started on it. It's a really rich problem, so grab something and just take a second to think about how you might do this problem. Talk to a neighbor. I haven't talked a lot, so talk to each other and play with this problem just for a minute so you get a sense of the math in it.
Not thought about using geometry. Even if like think about rectangles. Even that I don't think would be enough. I wanted to guide that.
I think if you said, I'm just imagining if this problem were another question, and they looked at me, and I was back and I said, about rectangles. They look like you're like an actual
right. Like you would be an alien, right? But I'm wondering now.
Like, what color is the sky?
Right.
If that was
Yeah. But then this is the question. How would we get kids to start thinking graphically about this?
Right.
Like, there's an algebra system, you're clearly a geometry system. How would we get there?
Right. Without dropping it. Yeah.
I think maybe that's
super rich problem, right?
Yeah.
Super rich problem. So I play with it on paper, and I come up with an answer, and I have no way of knowing if I'm right. It's been so long since I've done a problem like this, I just don't know. And I finally decide to tweet it out. And I'm new to Twitter, so it's sideways. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to break a tweet in the middle yet. I found this, I got 7. I kind of worked backwards and did some substitution. And I tweeted it out, and my hands were shaking. And then Kate immediately replied, so supportive. And then all these people chimed in on the conversation. I remember Christopher Selby using a number line on Desmos. I remember Justin Lanier had done it a different way, and he had insight into my strategy. We jumped into this. I think Brian, you chimed in on this one about resisting the quadratic formula, and we had this great conversation. And at the end of it, I thanked them. You probably can't see all these little tiny words, but I just thanked them. You can tell this question's been on my mind from the get-go. What does it mean to have elementary and secondary interacting on Twitter around a math problem like this? And that their wait time for me and their support, if I had been right or wrong, I still think I would have gotten the kind of support I got, kind of meant the world to me. And so this was the moment that if you ask me when I joined Twitter, this was the moment I joined Twitter. So if you think about it, I think one interpretation of that story is that as an elementary teacher, I got to work on my content by hanging out with secondary teachers. And I think that's true. I don't think that's the only thing I think is true, though. So we're going to talk a little bit more. Story number 2, close the lesson. This came from Michael Fenton's experiment with slow math chat, which I loved. I hope somebody else will take up that mantle. And so he has this question. Can you read this in the back? Yeah, I know it's hard in the afternoon. And so what do you do? What not to do during the last 5 minutes of class? And this was my response: was never skip the close. If you have to stop something else earlier so that you get to your close, do your close. And I went off about this a little bit. And the always delightful Dan Anderson tweeted this back. Secondary teacher asking an elementary teacher and others, it's a dot reply, about pedagogy, right? So this is a really interesting one for me because the close is something that I have noticed is a big difference between elementary and secondary. I feel like all the elementary teachers I know have like a little filing cabinet in their mind of 8 to 10 different closes that we use depending on what we want to get out of a lesson. We might do a gallery walk, we might have kids reflect in their journals, we might bring them together for a discussion around specific things. Like as I'm watching students work, I might be looking for a new strategy to emerge, a new representation or an organizational strategy I want to highlight. I might see everybody tripped up on number 6, so we're going to talk about number 6 at the end. I might see a favorite no kind of a thing, a mistake that I think is fantastic, and I use that as the close, and we come together and discuss it. I might pick 2 representations that have the same math but look different and post them and ask the kids to find the same math in the 2. This is called a connect and compare discussion. It's in Intentional Talk, is a fantastic book, and they go into this kind of discussion. So I feel like I know these inside and out so that I can think on my feet. I always plan the close, but I can adjust it based on what my kids do. And when I had student teachers in secondary math now and then, or when I visit secondary math, I don't see closes like this. I see a lot of teaching to the bell. I see a lot of the close is, okay, pack up your stuff. Whatever you didn't finish, do that for homework. I'll see you tomorrow. Or I see an exit ticket. But I don't see the same types of close. And I might be wrong about that. If I'm wrong about that in any room, it's this one, because you guys might be experimenting with closes. But I think in general in secondary math, there's a lot of thought about the hook because you have unengaged kids. So you put a ton of your planning energy into the opening of the lesson. How am I going to get kids motivated? But maybe a little bit less mental energy into the close. And the close is where you really pull the learning out. So we had this whole conversation. What happened is I pulled in some elementary peeps like, hey, I'm thinking about the close of the lesson. There's got to be a resource that has gathered all the different closes, and we could share that here, which it turns out there's not, and I've been meaning to write it ever since. But my friends started chiming in, and at the end, Dan was like, oh man, this has been awesome. he leaves all inspired. So that was February 20th. February 23rd, he reopens the thread and he tells us what he did. It's like, fantastic. A week and a half later, he reopens the thread again and thanks us for this conversation. And he's thanking mostly elementary people here, right? Because what we talked about, these things that we know in elementary, actually influenced his teaching. I think it was a calculus class, in this way, right? So when I step back and I think about that story, one interpretation of that story is that a secondary teacher learned some pedagogy by hanging out with elementary teachers, right? So, but I'm not done with my stories. This is another thing I think, but it's not the only thing I think. This was the, this is, might be my favorite. So, Quarter of the Cross comes from PCMI. So I love PCMI. I haven't gotten to go for the whole summer yet, but I got to go for a weekend, and I was one of 2 elementary people there. It was a room of secondary people largely, and I felt slightly nervous about doing math with everybody, especially because they said it was going to be modular arithmetic, and I got like zero modular arithmetic in my own upbringing. But I was game to try, and they gave us this particular problem, which was an adaptation of a bad test item. So before we do anything, you gotta play with the math. This, by the way, this is something elementary teachers know, right? Like, you gotta always play with the math first. So, people in the aisle, if you look under your chairs, there's a stack of papers. I did the best I could estimate it and pass them to the sides. Everybody take a few minutes, and the directions are color. So here's what happened at my table. This is also a really rich task. Play with this again later. What happened at my table is all the secondary teachers immediately put their heads down. Not like you guys here. You're different, right? So they immediately put their heads down and they used the area formulas to do this. They all sort of proved, they colored in one of the outer pieces and then quartered the middle one, and they started calculating the area of a rectangle and the area of a triangle, and they were adding those together. And one of them looked up, and she looked over at me, and this is what I was doing, using the window, right? And I folded it like this, and then I unfolded it, and I colored it in. And and her jaw dropped. And I swear this was her question. The high school math teacher said, "How did you know how to do that?" And I said, "My students don't know those formulas, but every one of my students can do this problem. Using symmetry, using visual arguments, using what they know about fractions. This problem's accessible to all of them." And then I had folded it, because I folded it, I could see through, so I traced it, and I did it a different way on the back just for fun. And they were all like just watching, right? So then we get to the second problem, and I start to work, and none of them picks up their pencils. They're all just looking at me. And I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We want to see what you're going to do." So this is a watershed moment for me, right? Because what she said to me was, "I'm so stuck in my formulas. I've forgotten how to think about something like this. And the way you think about it is so refreshing and surprising to me. You're making me think new things, so I want to see how you're going to do it." So, story doesn't end there. Heather was there. She's awesome about tweeting stuff out. She said, "Play along at home." She and James were making a Which One Doesn't Belong out of this. Josh Kroll was making a new, different, fantastic version of it. And literally on the other side of the earth, like almost if you drove a stake through the earth, if you were in New England, David Butler is a professor of mathematics in Adelaide, in South Australia, and he saw it and he was like, "Oh, I love this task." So he does it the next day with his class, college math class, and he tweets this picture. And I'm like, what? So I ran him back, and I'm like, "Oh my God, how those kids with the curved shapes defend their work?" And he says, "It's the most awesome thing. Picture coming," and he sends us the picture. And then he sends a proof that they did it. And he's like, they're so surprised, they got 3 exclamation points. it's this beautiful proof that he and his student worked out together. And when I post this slides, look at it. I know you can't see it here, but it's really lovely. It's delightful. And then Amy, who's the reason we know each other, Amy Albrecht is also in Adelaide. She's awesome. She's so artful. She was like, whoa, that's awesome. And then he says, I looked it up. It's called the Loons of Alhazen. And I was like, are you kidding me with that name? That's like the best sci-fi name I ever heard in my life. So I go Google Alhazen, who turns out to be an Iraqi, what is now current day Iraq, mathematician who lived 1,000 years ago and figured out optics and was a theoretical physicist and mathematician. And he's so important, he's on their money. And I've never heard of him because I grew up in the United States with our whitewashed Eurocentric history of math, right? So I'm learning about this guy I didn't know anything about, and I'm like, this is awesome. And then David Butler keeps going because he's so inspired by the Quarter of the Cross task that he keeps making them. And I'm sure some of you have seen this picture. He eventually blogs his favorite 100 solutions that he's made, which inspires our friend Simon Gregg, who is a lovely elementary teacher in Toulouse, France, to make his own out of pagodas and something I'm not going to say because that would just sound really filthy. It's not just me, right? I'm not going to say that word. Graham, you want to say it? It's a life dream of mine to hear you say that in your Scottish accent, so you got to do that for me before we get back. So this is like gorgeous, beautiful. And so now here's why. This started as a task for secondary teachers, worked on by an elementary school teacher, bounces up to college, bounces back to elementary, and this is where I go. This is what I know now. This is what I know. And we have this space here where we can do it, where we can talk math together and do math together. That puts me, I finally get what Max was talking about a year ago, when I first talked about whether I should come to Twitter Math Camp in Minneapolis. I said I was going to come, and he said, this is my favorite thing about Twitter, is all the people learning together from all the other people. So I feel really proud that I'm only 1 year behind Max. Normally it's a bigger gap. So my final story, what are we doing here? Is a recent one. This is the place I am now. I was in a 5-6 classroom and a student says this: everything with a perimeter has an area. Smoking. And I take a picture of it because I know I'm going to have an amazing experience in the classroom, and later on I'm going to have an amazing experience on Twitter. And I post it on Twitter, and I get the reaction from Christopher I know I'm going to get, because this is beautiful. And we start playing. And I no longer feel any of this fear I felt with Kate. I feel like I can completely be myself. I am home here, right? So we start playing and other people start chiming in, and we end up talking about, I'm going to back up, we end up talking about the degenerate rectangle. Christopher introduces this idea to me that I've never thought of a degenerating rectangle, which he describes as a rectangle that starts to collapse down into a line segment. And we start playing with what happens to its perimeter as it collapses and what happens with its area as it collapses. And then Dave jumps in. I think this is the first time we ever talked on Twitter. He jumps in and he's talking about it from a calculus point of view. And I'm talking about it from a calculus point of view, sort of, but my words are real rusty, and I'm like, not worrying about that. I'm saying, I bet I'm getting some of the words wrong, but I hope you know what I mean. And he decides it would be helpful for us to have a picture. So he goes over to Desmos. Let me see if I can do this real quick. And he makes us a thing, so that he in St. Louis and Christopher in Minneapolis and me in Maine, we can all look at this thing. So he says, press play. So think about what's happening with its area and perimeter right now. Holy cow! And I sit there at my computer computer at my dining room table and I'm watching this thing collapse and recreate and collapse and recreate, and I'm thinking about area and perimeter. You want to watch it one more time? Yeah, what just happened there? So, we're having so much fun that Matt Unlow, I love this tweet. It's like one of my favorite tweets.
Yes.
As if we talk about degenerate rectangles every day in third grade, right? So, we're having the best time. So, last week, I looked back at who was in this conversation. I'm going to play Max and Annie's favorite game. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Who am I talking with?
White dudes.
White dudes. 6 white dudes, right? 6 white dudes who've been on Twitter longer than I have, who teach math that's supposed to be more advanced than the math I teach. And I'm talking with them as an elementary school teacher, and we're playing with degenerate rectangles. So, this is unthinkable in our brick and mortar world. If I said to the 5th grade teacher, here's what I want you to do with this kid's conjecture. I want you to get in your car. I want you to drive over to the high school. Go find the math department. There are going to be 6 white guys sitting around a table. I want you to introduce yourself to them and say, hey, this kid said this cool thing, let's play with it. Right? Are they going to do that? Laughable. In fact, they would look at me like I was crazy because I'm actually asking them to live an anxiety nightmare. They're not going to do that because they're afraid that they will be made to feel stupid. And they're afraid that they will be condescended to. And some of that is their insecurity, and I'm sorry to say some of that is based in experience, right? So, but here, we can do it. And then I think about Dan Anderson asking about closing the lesson. Is he going to get in his car and drive over to the elementary school and sit in one of the tiny plastic chairs and say, you guys talk about lessons in a different way than we do, so let me just hang out with you and learn how you close lessons. He's not going to do that either, is he? And this is where I need help from you. I hope you guys will pull me aside or tweet me or something. I'm not exactly sure, we were talking about this in the bar last night, what his fear would be, or your fear would be about doing that. If I suggested that, go to your local elementary school and talk to the teachers there. And I'd like to know what it is. So here's where I am, is that this happens nowhere else. It doesn't happen in our brick and mortar world. Growth mindset, baby. Right? So that brings me to my calls to action. I know I'm only supposed to have one, but my talk. So there are 2, and they are, you can take either or both or neither, of course, you're grown-ups. One's a lot easier than the other. So the first one is to look at who you're following on Twitter. When I first thought about this call to action, I did this. I sat down. At the time, I was following 394 people. I could not find a way to extract what they teach in an efficient way through data, because people put different stuff in their bios. So I literally printed them out. It took me about an hour. I made some categories, and I sorted people into the categories. And we all, as Christopher famously said, this is the staff lounge of my dreams, right? So we all populate our staff lounges with who we want to be in there. For me, these are my categories. I keep Twitter pretty professional. And these are the kinds of people I follow. I'm in publishing, so I'm going to have a publishing chunk. And I counted them up, and this was my pie chart. And because of time, I'm not going to let you, I was going to ask you to predict which was which. But think about it just for a second. And this is what they are.
Does mathematicians mean college teachers?
It means professional mathematicians.
So I'm not. Oh.
Who's not on that? Students? Is that what you said? Yeah, I'm not following students. You got a problem with that? I was pleased with this. I didn't set out to create a spread like this, but if I'm going to have the kinds of rich conversations I've been describing to you, I need a pretty colorful pie chart. So like I was saying earlier, I need my elementary people and they need me and we need to be able to talk, but I also need to be following people who teach different content areas than I teach different grade levels than I teach, so that I can have these kinds of conversations. So that's the first call to action, is to just take a little time and figure out who you're following on Twitter. If you want recommendations for elementary, give me a call. The second one's the hard one. I have to wonder what would make it thinkable that we could do this in our districts. So I don't have a neat activity for you on this, but I want you to think about, you have a couple minutes, I want you to just talk to a neighbor or in a notebook, these two questions. What are the obstacles to collaboration? Like I already described some, right? What's keeping us from talking like this in our districts? And what's special about the Math Twitter blogosphere that we can't really take home? Like, you guys are available to me 24/7, that's not gonna happen at home, right? But there are other aspects of what we do that could happen at home. So what are the obstacles to that happening, and can we tear them down? And what would we need to do? What kind of conditions and culture do we need to create in order to make it happen? So I'm not gonna give you 2 minutes, I'm gonna give you like just 45 seconds or so. But just think about that for a minute. Is there something you could be doing in your district to create this kind of vertical collaboration? To the people who are doing afternoon sessions. But I hope that this question sparks a longer conversation, and I want to be part of it in whatever venue you have it. If you want, come find me and let's talk about this more. Because I feel, and I just want to reiterate at the end, I don't feel like I said this clearly, but all these thoughts are, I hope you understand, they're given in the spirit of appreciation for our community, awe at our community. The Math Twitter blogosphere is us, and we are it. It is the world we want to make it. I am immensely grateful for the open arms with which I was greeted in this community. So this is my effort to maybe push to make it a little bit better and more inclusive, and also to take the lessons from what we do here and figure out how can we make it better for people who are not in our space. So I hope it was taken in that kind of tone. So please be in touch with me about what you tried, and thank you so much for having me. It was a total honor.